Theological Union in Berkeley. Her research focuses on mission and spirituality, popular devotion practices, and feminist embodiment spirituality. Her interest is to bridge the interdisciplinary relationship between the mission, culture, and the church, as well as to utilize the inner self-knowledge as a creative power for feminist spiritual empowerment. Next up, we will have Joy Barnitz. There we go. Thank you. Joy is a recognized lay leader with experience in 3 Christian denominations. She has worked in individual church societies at the denominational level in interfaith settings and has managed organization transitions with a focus on leadership, program development, and fundraising. Joy is a certified labyrinth facilitator and has led services integrating the arts and the labyrinth in traditional Christian worship in interfaith settings. She also cultivates in product development in the biopharmaceutical and diagnostics industries, where she finds her seminary training is surprisingly useful. Next up, we have Ifawarinwa, a former assistant law director for the city of Cleveland and attorney in private practice. In her words, I am in active status as I matriculate in seminary. I'm an NDiv candidate pursuing ordination in the United Church of Christ. I'm an initiate traditional Ifa priest and Orisha Oya priest in the pre-Christian indigenous religious tradition of the Yoruba people of West Africa. As an African-American lesbian feminist womanist, published author, and emerging scholar, I pursue justice in beloved communities for all. My devoted spouse of 35 years, Amina, married, and I have 2 sons and daughters-in-law, 9 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren, as well as a multitude of foster children and grandchildren. We share our home with our cuddly boxer dog, Luna. So Marinda will be presenting on, again, mission and discipleship of female Catholic Christians in the Asian context. Joy will present on women of spirit and power. Could Sister Fidelma be real? And Ifawarinwa will present on the making of an American mystic, Reverend Dagmar, Braun, Celeste, ever-ascending spirals on the journey towards the beloved community. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy our presenters today. Up first, we have
So, thank you for the introduction. So, in the afternoon, the theme of this afternoon is Women Witness. So, just allow me to bring all of you now to Asia. So, we'll see what happened in Asia, the other side of the world, the mission and discipleship of the female Catholic Christians in the Asian context. So, I will read my paper, but accompany you with some images. The theme of the female discipleship is significant to theological investigation for women's mission, has long been witnessed for the early church period to the present. In the West, there is often stereotypes of Asian women as gentle, submissive, and underrepresented. On one hand, the women from the different Asian countries will experience domestic violence, poverty, and unequal opportunity for education and work. On the other hand, the ascent of the women into leadership is a phenomenon in many Asian countries. So these are some of the examples that the female leaders, politicians, also for human rights and also in their own professional world. This phenomenon calls for not only attention to women's role and rights in secular, social, and political areas, but also attention to the religious leaders to discern the role and the missions of women in the church. Therefore, the research question I propose is as follows. What are the unique ways and gifts that the female Catholic Christians have contributed to mission and evangelization in Asia? In order to answer such interrogation, I will base on the documents of the Federation of Asian Bishops Conference, which is a volunteer association in Asia approved in 1972 by the Holy See. And I will privilege as the FABC from this paper. So I will argue that the 3 particular aspects of gifts of female Christians, namely the mission of healing, the mission of hospitality, and the missions of harmony, so as to help the readers to understand how to reshape a feminist missiology for contemporary Asian women. So we'll go first to the mission of healing, rooted realities of Asia. Since biblical time, women were in Jesus' healing circle, and women always have a corner in Jesus' mission. So women encounter Christ through their own healing. Mary Magdalene and the Samaritan women both were healed before they went to proclaim the good news. In Asia nowadays, many women continue to need healing both physically and spiritually. The stark reality of women's situation all over Asia reveals the cries and the pain of the women. Asian women are still struggling to survive in poverty, in being the victims of physical, psychological, and sexual violence, in being deprived of opportunity for social, education, and political realities, in being unrecognized for their contribution to the church and society, and in experiencing oppression in the name of the religion. Women Christians have continued to engage their voices through their active participation in the FABC Plenary Assembly since 1977. Aside from the liberated dialogue from the top down, women from the bottom up have voiced their concerns by forming Women's Federation and Association. So this is some of the examples that the women form themselves as a group and then to proclaim their voice. They have organized regular conferences, publication, and actively participate in various social services or action in relation, particular to the lives of the oppressed and the margins. Feminist liberation theology pushes for the openness and dialogue between the lived experience and culture in Asia, an essential methodological attitude for contextual theology. So in various parts of Asia, a lot of missions relating to healing are run by women religious orders, such as there's some example. Mother Teresa's Missionary of Charity, which give comfort and dignity for dying people in India. The Sister of the Good Shepherds, who run various teens and women's centers in many Asian countries, providing homes for teens pregnancy and abused women. And the Marinda Sister in Macau, who run a social service facility for the deaf people. These are only a few examples of the women religious order carrying out human missions at the margins and with the oppressed. The majority of these female religious congregations came from the West to Asia to establish their local provinces. From the beginning, these non-Asian female missionaries learned the local languages and inculturate their mission into the local context. Yet reminiscent of the Asian theologian Kosuke Koyama's theology method, namely water buffalo theology, in which theology is practiced from below with a mission of experiencing everyday reality together with the local people. Women are natural healers. Women possess a charism of comfort and relation building. FABC see the Asian women have an innate gift of showing God's compassion for others through personal connection. The impetus and the charism of women enable her to participate in areas of ministry especially suited to her. Her special capacity to love and give life made her receptive, sensitive, and reflective, thus equipping her for a more personal-oriented ministry. This personal-oriented ministry has fostered both religious and laywomen traditionally engaged in ministry as teachers, nurses, and social workers and other leadership roles in the community. Besides engaging in healing ministry, some Asian Christian women appeal action to respond to the call of the Pope Francis to care for our common home from his encyclical Laudato Si. Nature is the embodiment of ecofeminism, which affirms the concerns for life of all forms. The effect of global warming and climate change is the reality in Asia. In 2017, various Asian countries were devastated by the natural disaster, and 137 million people were put at risk. The cyclone Morahi, Bangladesh in May, more than 1,200 people were killed across India and Bangladesh, affecting the living condition for more than 41 million people. The rise in water in July across the Himalaya in South China caused over 12 million people to flee their home. Women Christians from South Asia gathered together in the region conferences, Climate Change Impact on Vulnerable Groups and Women's Perspective, organized by the Women's Desk of the FABC office. So the participants voiced out the negative consequences of the climate change and the unpredictable weather affecting the poor, especially women. One example is that millions of women still use wood or charcoal or coal daily to burn the stove in daily cooking. The regional conference searched for possible solutions and insights in creating an environmentally sustainable world. In Untitled, Cambodia, agricultural rhythm and food security are defined in relation to climate change. As most of the people in Untitled are farmers, women from the women's desk in Southeast Asia form groups to visit the families in 5 parishes in Untitled to listen to their crimes. They advocate for increased actions for greater awareness of the impact of climate change on local rural areas. The reality rooted in Asia called for a female mission of healing. Like those women in the early community of Christ, Christ liberates and heals the pain of the women, so they could proclaim and evangelize the good news of the Lord for themselves and for the women living in harsh realities of life. So the second one we'll go is the mission of hospitality, rooted in Christ. So Henry Newman see hospitality means primarily the creation of a free space where strangers can enter and become a friend instead of an enemy. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. His definition of hospitality resonates with the concept of mission. Mission is about inviting people to enter the loving relationship with Christ, to welcome and create space for people, allowing changes to take place. Since Christ is not all known in Asian context, the proclamation of Christ can be creatively carried out through dialogue in promoting the human community. The mission of hospitality is a great feature in Asian community. Asia is considered a high-context culture where families, communities, and relationships matter prominently in the lived experience of the people. In most Asian families, women, mothers, and grandmothers are the ones who hold space for family around the table of the feast, to take care and to nurture the family's need. In Jesus and Paul's mission, there were always women around like caretakers to prepare and provide food, places, and open their household for mission activities. Since the beginning, female discipleship is rooted in and with Christ and with hospitality. Table fellowship is a prevailing metaphor for the kingdom of God. Jesus' messianic banquet is for everyone, poor, sinners, and so forth. Hospitality is not just about food and opening a household. It is about welcoming all to the table of Jesus' fellowship. The Eucharistic feature of the table fellowship has the egalitarian dimension. When we eat and have a meal together, we are not strangers. Rather, we create a relationship with our fellow neighbors and with God. The dining table is the central gathering place for a family to share life experiences, to hold intimate conversation, to feel replenished and support each other. And most importantly, it is a place for being a family. Specifically in the Asian context, the Asian woman is the center of the dining table. This feature is not about depreciating women to do the role of the household court. Rather, it resembles the nature of family attributes, which is nurture and love that unite families and sustain community together. Unfortunately, not everyone can have a dining table to sit at. For all over Asia, many women are forced to leave their homes to be migrant workers in order to be the breadwinners of the children and family. The Marinda sister in Japan opened a Filipino migrant worker center to minister to migrant workers. Migrant workers are often victims of domestic abuse. Some are forced to overstay until they have legal status, causing them to be exploited by the agents and forcing many into prostitution. The Catholic religious women in India are the backbones of the prison ministry. They have regular visits to prison, meet with the family of the prisoners, and arrange for the rehabilitation of those who are released and unite and join their own families. In Macau, the religious sister of Missionary of Charity distribute lunch or dinner boxes regularly to the homeless. They visit families in the poorest area so as to accompany them and to share a meal together. Caritas Macau has also run a food bank to distribute food to annually 2,200 elderly and low-income families by volunteer, and most of whom are women. All over Asia, Catholic parishes, Christian charity organizations, and religious orders provide ministry related to the mission of hospitality. It is not just about food distribution or providing a home. It is about sharing Christ's love to comfort and warmth to those who do not have a family, and be company to sit with people at the dining table. Once again, women's contribution is insurmountable. Women in Asia continue to witness Christ faithfully and to bring Christ to their daily lived experience, such as listening compassionately to the anguish of women sex workers, witnessing the exploitation of women's laborers, sharing the brokenness of women in distress, and also celebrating the sisterhood with women from non-Christian faiths. So the last one is the mission of harmony, rooted in community. Asian embrace the richness of diverse faith tradition in the world, as 85% of the entire world's non-Christians live in Asia. In response to the phenomena of religion in Asia, the unique feature of the FABC mission's theology is to emphasize on dialogue. In FABC Plenary Assembly state, quote, the Asian bishops have spoken of evangelization in Asia as involving a freehold dialogue with the poor, the culture, and the religions of Asia. Dialogue and this have to carry out with harmony, which is crucial in the continent's interreligious context. Asian has an organic approach to understanding reality, and, quote, Asian religious cultures see human beings, society, and the whole universe as intimately related and interdependent. Fragmentation and division contradict this version, end of quote. Asian reality is rooted in community, not the individual. Keeping the society in harmony is particularly important in Asian context. But the reality in Asia are full of disharmony brought by the humankind, the economic exploitation and poverty, oppressive forms of government and social control, religious cultures and communal conflicts, ecological and environmental crisis, abuse of science and technology, and the burdened history of Christianity, which threaten, weaken, and diminish the life of Asia. The FABC see the urgent situations of conflicts and disharmony and have made effort to search for a Christian way of reading and restoring these broken realities. The emphasis is not to adopt an approach from the outside or by an outsider, but by those living and experiencing these conflicts, and also situation calling for reading and listening to the message God is given through reality. Many Asian women, being the victims of conflicts and disharmony, become a powerful source of fostering a theology of harmony in Asian realities. Women in Asia engage in dialogue with other religions through everyday interaction with their interfaith marriage, with neighbors of other faiths, through market, workplace, and full collaboration for common good. In the Philippines, religious women have a central role in reaching out to the Muslim community by providing children's services. Vietnamese religious women collaborate with the Buddhists to take care of homeless children. In Pope Francis' recent address to the interfaith dialogue, he emphasized that women's innate skill of listening, welcoming, and openness to others weave the delicate fabric of dialogue between all men and women of goodwill. Women, by building a personal relationship with people of other religions, offer a rich way of fostering interreligious dialogue. So this is my conclusion. By exploring various FABC documents, women's discipleship is confirmed regardless of gender and culture. The profound religiosity and the richness of culture in Asia open up spaces for women to exercise their gifts that can emerge into all forms of ministry, fighting for women's rights, oppression, injustice, violence, and poverty. Women comprise a vital force to the church and make her more human. The effort of FABC in cultivating a participatory church brings women into the forefront of various leadership roles, which result in stronger and more efficacious collaboration with the local church, the local government, NGO, and the International Institute in addressing the moral, social, and economic needs of women. Dialogues between the FABC and women and mission female Christians as a crucial driving force that could transform Asian society, families, and the church. Through the mission of healing, hospitality, and harmony, women contribute to the restoration of harmony within the Asian context, in contrast to the stereotype of Asian women as gentle, submissive, and underrepresented. Women in this paper are strong, assertive, and individualized. When women walk on the road to Emmaus, they dare to turn to those who are walking with and beside them, listening to their burning hearts and recognizing that Jesus is with them.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Somehow it seems appropriate to begin a talk with a confession, at least in this context. Part of my self-care regime is reading fiction, and I particularly enjoy historical fiction. So today's talk was inspired by fictional reading of self-care and a paper written for a history of the church class. So sometimes the topic for academic research presents itself disguised as a fictional character, in this case, Sister Fidelma, the central character of a series of popular mystery novels, I think there are more than 20, by Peter Tremaine, who is the pen name of Peter Beresford Ellis. Sister Fidelma is a young, vowed religious woman, an advocate, lawyer, to the second highest degree, in case anybody cares, in the court of the 5 kingdoms of Ireland, and she is sister to the king of one of those kingdoms. Using Sister Fidelma in the role of detective, Ellis immerses the reader in 7th century Ireland, exploring the Irish culture, Irish laws, and highlighting differences between Roman and Celtic Christian religious traditions. My long-standing interest in women and leadership was piqued when I read these novels and wondered, could Sister Fidelma have really existed? So in this paper, I will briefly touch on 4 topics. The evidence for a distinctive Celtic Christian church, some of the narratives that were crafted around the woman who became or is known as Saint Bridget, the historical evidence that actually we can find concerning women's roles in Ireland and the early Irish church, and finally the Synod of Whitby, which was convened by a woman and is looked at by historians as a turning point in the tension between the Celtic-Roman struggle for which Christian tradition would be preeminent in the British Isles. Recent interest in Celtic Christianity has focused on the ideal of a culture in balance with nature, with sacred places where males and females are treated as equals, and where the new Christian faith seamlessly absorbed prior pagan faith. This ideal forms an attractive alternative to the standard history of Western Christianity. As noted historian Philip Sheldrake puts it, for early Celtic Christians, the natural landscape was both a concrete reality where people lived and, at the same time, a doorway into another spiritual world. The creator of Sister Fidelma subscribes to what I call the romantic view of the Christian tradition in Ireland during the 4th through 7th centuries. For Ellis, the role of women in Ireland in the 1st centuries of the Common Era is by no means a passive or subservient one, as emerges in other European cultures. Women could govern, took prominent roles in political, religious, and artistic life, even becoming judges and lawgivers. They could own property, which marriage could not deprive them of. They chose when they wanted to marry, and more often than not, who they wanted to marry. They could divorce, and if they were deserted, molested, or maltreated, they had the right to claim considerable damages. This view of women in Celtic myth, law, and early history now seems to constitute more of an ideal rather than accurately reflecting daily lives, which is noted by another scholar, Donna Mead. who offers a rather contrasting view, albeit one focused on vowed religious women in communities. He says, although the early churches of Britain and Ireland admitted women as nuns, they did not grant them independent legal status. Society was avowedly patriarchal, and women who made it to the top as abbesses were the exceptions that proved the rule. It is likely that the church helped to raise the status of women in early Ireland, but this does not mean that it emancipated them. The Celtic church offered no escape from or counterbalance to the claims of patriarchy. The feminist Celtic church is thus another figment of contemporary countercultural imagination. Sadly, the historical evidence indicates that although the laws may have been somewhat more favorable to women than in other parts of Europe, women were probably not treated significantly differently in Ireland or in the Irish church than they were in other areas of Europe. Women were not legally independent in the patriarchal society in Ireland, and they required the authorization of a superior, who was usually male, to conduct transactions. Although there were a variety of Celtic churches in the British Isles and in Brittany, which shared many aspects of cultural and religious life, there's little evidence that there was a unified, coordinated entity, identified and identifiable as a distinct, coherent, ecclesiastical entity called the Celtic Church. Turning to St. Bridget, who is often called one of the Blessed Trinity of Ireland, central to the story of the establishment of Christianity in that land, we have direct information for the other two, St. Patrick and St. Columba, from their very own writings. We don't have that for Bridget. She's claimed to have founded the monastery at Kildare, but there's no direct or contemporary evidence supporting that assertion. Hagiographers of the time were charged with promoting the claims of such monasteries, which were established by local saints, to ensure their prestige and financial success of those monasteries. The three oldest vitae of St. Bridget were written about 150 years after her death and provide little insight into the life of the real historical woman who became St. Bridget, or even if there was such a person. Modern scholars hold a variety of views as to the extent to which pre-Christian material was woven into the early Celtic Christian literature, and this lies at the heart of debates that continue to this day between nativists and anti-nativists in this field of Celtic studies. The key elements of Bridget's life story, as related in popular and scholarly sources, are readily available, so I won't go into them, but they're quite fun. She's undoubtedly the most famous woman associated with the Celtic Church, and in brief, her father was either a Druid or the King of Leinster. Her mother was either one of her father's bondswomen or a slave. Bridget is thought to have studied with bishops of the Irish Church, becoming a nun, and by some accounts, she became an ordained bishop. She's claimed to have founded the double monastery, which means that the members were both men and women, at Kildare, about 500 Common Era, although as I said earlier, there's no direct contemporary evidence for that. And given the lack of this contemporary evidence, scholars are rather wary of placing too much reliance on the three extant vitae. In his discussion of Bridget, Ian Bradley notes that the Vita Prima closely identifies Bridget with the cause of the kings of Leinster, the province in which Kildare is situated, bringing them victory in at least one important battle, and thereby becoming the patron of Leinster, a title Bridget held until the 11th century. That's a pretty long tenure for a woman soldier. Bridget's hagiographers created a superhero by portraying her in a manner more akin to that of her male counterparts than to other female saints. And by the 19th century, Bridget was well established as a military protector, an archetype of moral purity, a Christianized goddess, and a bringer of fertility. It seems likely that if she existed at all, the person who became St. Bridget was different from both the pagan goddess of the same name and from the saint depicted by her hagiographers. Ireland was never part of the Roman Empire, nor was it on any well-traveled trade routes. This isolation means that what happened in Ireland cannot be readily extrapolated to other areas of Celtic Christianity in the British Isles. There's relatively little documentation available to the historian. In particular, there are few texts from the pre-Christian period. What sources and materials do exist are extremely patchy over time. Material of one sort may be relatively abundant in one period, but scarce or absent in another. Thus, the evidence becomes discontinuous. Where texts do exist, the dates are often disputed, frequently over a range as wide as 2 centuries. The variety of genres is also an issue. For example, laws are by nature normative and prescriptive, but there's often very little evidence that they were applied in any particular way. Not enough case studies. Other sources, such as theological tracts and lives of the saints, generally lack the kind of cultural, contextual information that we would currently rely on as historical conclusions. From such patchy evidence, historians do conclude that by the 5th century, there were both male and female vowed religious in Ireland in communities, and they could and they did marry, sometimes each other anyway. Archaeological evidence indicates that the monasteries of this time were comprised of small community of residential huts rather than grand structures. During the period of the formation of the Irish Church, 4th through 7th centuries, the lives of the saints consistently claim churches and monasteries were founded by peripatetic missionary leaders. They are also consistent in saying that these leaders tended to found numerous places rather than just one place. And one finds both women and men founding, one finds women founding autonomously and men founding places on behalf of women. There was no difference in the manner, however, in which these monasteries were founded. Both women and men did so in the same manner. They traveled, they converted pagans, they befriended bishops, they acquired land and followers and established churches there. Christina Harrington describes the founding of Kildare, remember, supposedly by Bridget, as follows. The monastery was founded out of a public demand, with people of both sexes pledging their vows to Bridget. Thus, a 7th century churchman imagined that in the century preceding him, a holy woman, a consecrated nun, could have developed a national following and built herself a large monastery for followers of both sexes. He relates this without explaining to his readers how a nun could have acquired the land or the temporal authority to do this. Harrington concludes that for Irish hagiographers, consecrated women were able to participate in the apostolic work of spreading Christianity and of founding churches and monasteries. Textual evidence suggests that the earliest churches sometimes developed into cult centers and cemeteries after the death of the leader, whether the leader was male or female. Thus, while women may not have had as broad authority or equal status as men, their hagiographers could and did put them into roles where their impact was equal to their male counterparts. St. Bridget, founder of Kildare, is as well known and beloved as St. Patrick, who founded Armagh, and St. Columba, who founded Iona. Lastly, we come to a real woman. Known as St. Hilda now, she was the convener of the Synod at Whitby, held in 664 Christian era. Viewed as the turning point and sometimes portrayed as a kind of Armageddon between an overbearing, bureaucratic Roman church, on the one hand, and a small, self-effacing Celtic church on the other. Donald Meek observes, there was no killing at Whitby, and Irish monks continued to be very active in Anglo-Saxon England long after 664. Again, the encounter is sometimes seen as a culture clash. In reality, it doesn't fit any of these interpretations. It was part of an ongoing attempt to bring uniformity to the diverse practices of Christendom. Most of what we know about St. Hilda and the Synod comes from Bede's the ecclesiastical history of the English people. The conference was convened to come up with a conclusive answer of which strain of Christianity to maintain. The meeting wasn't really a synod in the religious sense at all. It was more of a political council convened by a king, attended by nobles and advisors, where the king would come to a decision and pass judgment. A major issue was the settling of the standard date for Easter, as the Roman tradition and the Celtic tradition celebrated on different days. Obviously, this could be a problem in the following, because the king of Northumbria, who convened the council, grew up in the Celtic tradition, and his wife was from the south of England and grew up in the Roman tradition. You can tell where this is going. Another issue of great interest that was resolved by this conference, though, was the tonsure that the monks should wear, because the Irish form was long hair and bald from the front, whereas, of course, the well-known Romans is a circlet of hair like the crown of thorns. Two major issues, so we can tell that domestic harmony and hairstyles were very important. And at its conclusion, the king decided for the Roman tradition. Domestic harmony ruled out. And there is a legend, there's always a legend with these, that he feared St. Peter would turn him away at the pearly gates if he chose the Celtic tradition. Abbess Hilda is actually one of the few women for whom there is solid historical evidence, mostly again from Bede's ecclesiastical history. We know she was a princess, the daughter of the nephew of King Edwin of Northumbria, that she was brought up in Edwin's court and baptized with Edwin's family in 627 Common Era. 20 years later, Aidan, who many of you may know as Saint Aidan, the renowned Irish missionary and the Bishop of Lindisfarne, called Hilda to establish a monastic community of women, and later to become abbess of yet another community that had been established. About 650 Christian era, Common Era, she founded a community which was named Whitby later by the Danes. In all of the communities, she followed the practices used in the monastic communities of Iona. There's some historical evidence of how the people lived in that community, etc. So it was not a grand structure. They think the members lived in small houses, and women and men worshiped together, but they lived in separate accommodations. One scholar, Ian Bradley, observes the outcome of the Whitby debate may have actually promoted new interest in the early Celtic experience. Just as outsiders and exiles tend to give more honor to prophets than their own kinfolk do, so victors are apt to romanticize what they once sought to destroy. Bradley uses this as a romantic view because he says this gave rise to the episodic, periodic recurrence of interest in Celtic Christianity, which he maintains has had 6 revivals over the past 1,300 years. Obviously, we are still longing for something. In conclusion, the historical evidence supports women being active in the early Christian church in the British Isles. Their roles appear to have been similar to those in other areas of the Christian church. They were governed in large part by local custom and culture. In my quest to find out if the fictional Sister Fidelma could have really existed, I encountered 2 prominent women, a legendary woman in St. Bridget and a real woman in St. Hilda. Like Abbess Hilda, Sister Fidelma is a princess and a vowed religious woman, although it is her status as a lawyer and advocate in the courts that is most central to her fictional detective efforts. It is unlikely that such a person as Sister Fidelma did live. However, I find, like her, like Bridget's hagiographers, it's believable she could have lived in 7th century Ireland. And I, for one, hope that she did.
Orisha tí ó bá gbìn ní omi ṣeré ìní àmọ́ ṣe o ẹ̀ṣù gbẹ̀mí o wọ́n máa sí o. Bọ̀rọ̀ bébé tìrìrì lọ́nà ẹ̀ṣù tìrìrì ẹ̀ṣù gbẹ̀mí o wọ́n máa sí o. Lọ́lọ́dẹ tìrìrì ìwà pẹ̀lẹ́ abatina àtìrìrì èṣù tìrìrì èṣù gbẹ̀mí o wọ́n máa sìn yó. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Oyasuuru Ifawarinwa. My birth name is Leslye Maria. Last name changed many times, so that's not important. But I'm here today to talk about the making of an American mystic. Ironically, the person I'm going to talk about is not African. She's from Austria. But it's important that I talk about her, and it's important that I talk about her because I have been looking for ways in which we can pull ourselves out of the miasma that is chronic, a chronic problem with the habit of domination. How do we disconnect ourselves from empire in a certain sense? And I've been watching the life of Reverend Dagmar, Braun, Celeste for many, many years. I've known her for many years. And she is a person who I think has some keys that we might want to take a look at. So today, Reverend Dagmar Celeste is known internationally as the first American Roman Catholic woman priest. And this year she celebrates her 16th year in service as a priest in her selected communities. Now this all occurred in 2002. The National Catholic Reporter's Vatican correspondent reported from Germany that aboard a specially chartered pleasure boat, he called it, on the Danube River, 7 Catholic women, 4 Germans, 2 Austrians, and an anonymous American, were ordained before a gathering of over 200 of their family, friends, supporters, and journalists on the feasts of St. Peter and Paul. The event itself was dubbed the Danube Seven, and the women became known as the Danube Seven. The Danube Seven ordination, and the women were called the Danube Seven. Initially, Dagmar was anonymous, and the reason she was anonymous will become clear in a few seconds. Not until October of that year did she announce that she was indeed the anonymous American. The Catholic Church promptly excommunicated those 7 women and 2 of the bishops, and one of the bishops who ordained them. The other 2, for some reason, were not excommunicated, and we still don't know exactly why. But because they were not, the ordination process continued up till today. Newspapers in the United States at first didn't pay much attention to it when she was anonymous, but later, when they found out who she was, everyone, especially the newspapers in Ohio and New York, became very interested. Why? Because Dagmar was the former wife of, and very popular in Ohio, of the former governor of the state of Ohio. And that was news. Dagmar and Dick Celeste were very popular in their public office for very good reason. They brought Ohio into the 20th century in some ways. They cared about the people knew it. And but for term limits, he probably would have been elected many times. But who is Dagmar? In a society that prefers the either-or experiences. And we prefer to look at, is it this or is it that? Dagmar presents a conundrum. She has the both and realities of life that she presents as herself in every waking day. She's lived 77 years, very complex years, and I'd like to share some of that, her background with you so that you can see what it was like for her to move from her little village in Austria to Ohio and to become the first American Roman Catholic woman priest. In her memoir, she said that she grew up in Austria. She was born and raised there. She married in Austria. She was awakened in India. She was liberated, divorced, and now recovering in Ohio. One of her friends who was asked to write the foreword for her memoir said of Dagmar, she has never conformed to anyone's expectations, whether it was feminist work, or her political work, or her family work, and now her religious work. And she struggled with a large amount of pain and suffering, deep and wide, but seems like that pain and suffering has allowed her to mostly keep her head above water with her own internal strength. And when she submerged below the line of water, she was able to understand more of the ocean that is our lives. Well, Dagmar in 1941 was born in a little town called Krems an der Danube, I think I'm saying it correctly, Austria, at the time of a raging, warring world. Her mother was only 18 years old and very optimistic, very happy that she was born. Just the year before, another child had been born to them and lived only one day. That child, too, was named Dagmar. So, Dagmar was born to a very disappointed and very angry father. From what I understand, he was a chronically angry person and very disappointed with his status in life. He wanted a son to maybe help him on his personal battlefield. Now, war up close is always devastating to everyone involved, especially the poorest of the poor. They weren't exactly the poorest of the poor, but they were just making ends meet before the war occurred, and then after the war, they were completely devastated. Didn't help that Austria was in this precarious relationship with Hitler, so the country itself was occupied after the war. Dagmar says that it was more dangerous for her and her family after the war was over than before. At least she knew where to run when the bombs went off. But there was nowhere to run when the Russian soldiers moved into her home. They literally moved into her home, and they took over the living room. They only had one bedroom. By that time, Dagmar had a second sister. So there was a sister, Dagmar, her mother, sometimes her father, a grandmother, all living in a one-bedroom apartment, and the Russian soldiers moved in to take over the living room. With all the work that her mother and grandmother did to try to keep the home with some kind of joy in it for the children, including spending nights after long days of work, creating little toys for them, handmade toys and books for them. During the Christmas season that year, the Russian soldiers took those toys and sent them to their children. It took years for Dagmar to begin to see or to experience some empathy for those soldiers. So, how does that early life affect a person like Dagmar? Well, what happened next was that she was malnourished, and after the Russian soldiers left, they sent her away to Italy because the older children, were allowed to go through a Red Cross program to Italy. And she said even though there was hardships at home with her mother and her grandmother, she felt some kind of sanctuary in that space until she had to be sent away to Italy. Her sanctuary was gone. She didn't speak Italian. The people who housed her, although loving, didn't speak German. The core of her dislocation, that core experience of the dislocation, I think is what informs her mysticism at this point. So, when she'd come back after a year of being in Trieste, she would miss her host family. And when she'd come back to Trieste, she'd miss her family in Austria. How did she get to Ohio? Well, quickly, let me just share that she met a wonderful person in Oxford. She studied very hard. Her father didn't want her to marry a certain brute in Austria, so he sent her to Oxford, where she met Dick Celeste, a young, very attractive, I suppose, to her at the time, person who had some of the same kind of strident feminist values that she expressed. And as his career developed politically, she knew that she had to take on the position of a feminist woman, a strong woman who would be a sidekick, an equal partner, both in their relationship and in his work. So the background of having had a family that was raped and stolen from and brutalized during the war, she brought that with her, along with the sense of being poor. And when she moved to Ohio, one of the first things she did was look around her community, and she saw how many poor people were in America. Well, no one talks about America having poor people. And so right away in Cleveland, Ohio, she started the first hunger center for people who required that kind of nourishment. Later, when his career became more successful, she always promised that there would be something that she could do and would do for the people in her environment. And one of the first things that happened before he became lieutenant governor and then later governor was to join forces with a group of people, and this is how I met her, and later Amina Mary was a part of that too, where there was a young woman who had been denied the right to use the battered wife syndrome in court as evidence in her behalf, and she was given a life sentence without possibility of parole. Dagmar stepped into that and didn't let it go until years later, when Dick was the governor. She asked for and received an opportunity to reevaluate all of the women that were in prison in Ohio who hadn't had benefit of giving that information in the court as evidence in their behalf. And she was able, through her work, to get many of those sentences commuted, including the woman who she initially met in Cleveland. More than that, she developed a multidisciplinary, multi-departmental, multifaceted approach to family violence. And they invited 30 people to become members of the Governor's Task Force on Family Violence, and I was one of those people. I said, if this is going to be one of those, you know, things where you write a report and then it goes on the shelf, I don't want to be a part of it. She assured me that that wasn't true, and so did Dick. And what happened was we made 40 recommendations that changed 30 laws in Ohio. Thank you. Those laws were as complicated and as entrenched as the spousal rape exemption. Since that time, that was in the 80s, since that time they've gone back to the spousal rape exemption in Ohio. So when people ask if we're going forward or backward, you need to know. Well, later, after he completed his terms of office, they had a quasi-open marriage. And Dick, the only proviso was that they wouldn't fall in love with any selected partner. And Dick fell in love with someone else and divorced Dagmar. Now, during that time, she had already gone to seminary. She went to a Methodist seminary because he was Methodist. There was a Methodist seminary in Ohio. While he was governor, she did two things that are kind of off the beaten track. One, she announced in a meeting, in a presentation that she was giving publicly, that she was a lesbian while he was governor. Yes. And people asked him, well, what do you think about that? He said, well, you can't ask me or our 7 children. You can just ask Dagmar what she meant by that. Of course, she meant a lesbian as in one who loves and cares for women in this society. And she stands by that today. Dagmar walked through an urge to become, the call to become a priest for her entire life. When she was baptized, she felt that. When she was confirmed, she felt that. She had an extraordinary experience in spirituality, which she remembers to this day. What's important for me about Dagmar and her sense of herself was that when she was excommunicated, one of the things she said was, the excommunication was necessary. Because without the excommunication, the notion of women as priests would have gone under the carpet, I guess. And so the fact that the Pope of that time took notice enough to excommunicate them, said that it was something that it confirmed for them what they were needing to do. She said that her spirituality is of a spiritual warrior. Somebody who is not afraid of powers and principalities. One who is willing to risk her own life if necessary, but not willing to kill. She said more clearly that it is not that you're not afraid of the consequences. You know the consequences you're afraid of, and you know them all very well. She's afraid too at times, but not to the point of letting herself be deterred from her call. She also says that that all dogma tends to exclude. She said Jesus was not a Christian. Jesus had no church building, no celibacy, no performing the Eucharist in a particular way, no wearing certain attire, no unquestioned obedience to a bishop, no pope. All of those in Dagmar's mind are signs of dogma. Jesus did not ordain. Jesus was not ordained. Jesus did not select or ordain Matthias, who replaced Judas. Christianity, according to Reverend Dagmar, is a stage of spiritual evolution. We have not lost paganism just because we became Romans or Celts or whatever. Muslims haven't lost Jesus. The challenge is to figure out who you are and who are you to become naturally. going with your natural flow. Lastly, she said, that most people are afraid of mysticism. They fear that they'll be venturing out into something different, especially if you're good at doing what you've always done. But mysticism is going deep. Consider Jesus and the fishermen. They had been out all night and caught nothing. Kind of the way we are today in our society. We're working, and we haven't caught much. And Jesus said, try something different. Try another way. Earlier today, you heard Kiana talk about traditional religions as another way of seeing the divine. An additional way, not the only way, not an exclusivist way. And Dagmar equally advocates for a mysticism that is inclusive, radically inclusive, not exclusive. Thank you very much.
Let's have another round of applause for her. Now, before we conclude, we are moving towards our question and answer period. Does anyone would like to begin with a question for the panelists? Yes, sure.
Thanks. So my question is for Marinda, and thank you for your presentation, all of you. I was just wondering, if you quoted a bit from Pope Francis and some other documents that involve, I think what some might see as some gender essentialism around, innate skills or innate capacities of women. And I was just wondering, in your research and your scholarship, have you encountered anyone, particularly in the Catholic context, sort of speaking back to that or challenging that, or is it a different sort of more subversive use of some of those concepts? So
Definitely challenges. Because now more and more Asian theologians, especially female, they start to really look at the whole theology in Asia. Because they really look at the perspective from the women, but not so much on the kind of, we are so used to have the hierarchical church. Because in Asia, a lot of country is missionized or colonized by the Western power. So I think in this period, it's really kind of a beginning and struggle to really first rooted ourselves. Where are we? So some theologians in Asia, example, some groups, they started to group together, and then they really do critical also analysis and also present papers on different issues. That is quite totally different from so-called the Roman Catholic Church. So I think there is a lot of local voices that is coming slowly in progress, but I think there's a lot of space that we can really go more and more in this direction. Definitely.
Yes.
I had a question for Fatima.
Okay.
I'm wondering, did Reverend Dagmar talk about why she moved from, let's say, Methodism to Catholicism? I'm just curious.
She was always Catholic. Her
Okay, so
husband
she
was Methodist, and she wanted to find out what Methodism meant to him. So while he was being governor, she attended that school full-time and obtained an MA. She also was a very devout Catholic. I mean, the kind of Catholic person that goes to Mass at least once a day. And so moving from that kind of position to one of accepting a mystical view of the divine and seeing the divine in everything, which is far more like what indigenous peoples all over the world have thought and felt vis-a-vis the divine. That took some work.
Yes.
Fatima, could you explain how she got the name Dagmar?
Oh, well, I did explain that her sister, who died the year before her, was named Dagmar. But what's humorous about that, and I think this is what you're alluding to, She went to school and everyone had their birth date, and because it was a Catholic school, they had their Saints' Day, so they could celebrate 2 days. And she came home and asked her mother, well, who is Saint Dagmar? I want to know more about her so that I can have my Saint Day too. And she said, her mother laughed and said, there's no Saint Dagmar, and if you want to have a saint, you'll have to be good enough to be one yourself. So, she spent her years trying to
Still working.
measure up. I also would like to say, if anyone is interested in her, she did not give up the ministry simply because of the excommunication. She holds she convenes groups regularly, both in Cleveland and on a place called Kelly's Island.
And there's the movie about the ordination.
Yes, there is.
I forgot, what's the title? It was
Pink
Smoke?
Pink smoke.
Pink,
Smoke?
Yeah, pink smoke.
pink smoke, yeah,
Yes.
Pink smoke over the Vatican?
Yes.
Yeah.
over the Vatican.
And there are over 200 female priests at this point, Roman Catholic ordained priests at this moment in the United States alone, and it's a worldwide mission.
This is a question for each of the panelists. I'm Jennifer Davidson from ADSW. As I listened to you, I had a sense of hopefulness in hearing the session. It's called Women Witness. And there was a sense of hopefulness for me as I listened to each of your presentations. And since I had the privilege of getting to read each of your proposals, I know that at least a couple of you are actually intentionally drawing some strength from the subjects that you presented on today. So I just wanted to invite you each to say a comment about what feels hopeful to you, or what do you draw strength from in what you presented to us today.
Okay. Actually, really thank you so much the word hope, because now I feel hopeful. I think it's also one of why I come here for study from all the way from Asia. And I think one thing for me is the women. I can't speak of the whole Asia because Asia is so big with so many diverse cultures. But I can say the women in Asia, we tend to do first, less than thinking first. It's a little bit different, I feel, from here. But I think one of the things I can see is the perseverance of women when they are in poverty, in oppressed, in all this. They keep themselves alive first, because we can see we have a lot of also disaster, natural disaster. Every year, I think just the women or the marginalized or oppressed, they have to face is the natural disaster first. So I think that perseverance also gives me a lot of hope for myself, for my study, and for my own ministry with all these people that we are serving.
I like the idea of hopefulness. Certainly one of the things that attracted me to Fidelma as a character is that she's rather feisty and is argumentative, and she has the credentials, as she points out in almost every novel, that she has the credentials to address a king. And since I felt some sense of identity with that, so knowing that people imagine such people, so we have Bridget, who may have been many women, condensed into, packaged into one through hagiography. Just the fact that someone thought that was possible as an explanation struck me as pretty radical. And since Bridget or Bride or any of several names through the lands, the Scottish, Irish, and Brittany, you find that tradition through all of that. So there was a woman goddess. There's a deep tradition of healing, hospitality, and metalwork, and stitchery. So lots of things important for the home and for health and healing and actually everything that you talked about, Marinda. So the fact that that was pulled forward and, however, worked into the history and continues and sort of became a saint in Christianity suggests that there's hopefulness that we can, in fact, not only just borrow and appropriate, but continually go back. I really liked Bradley's term of, for 1,300 years, every so often it pops up, everybody's excited about ecology, and it's like, okay, so we get it wrong all the time. Well, wait a minute, it never goes away. So I think that resilience is an important part of spirit that I detected in all three of these. So.
Well, for me, I feel hopeful whenever I hear people talking about tearing down walls. Because I can remember reading one of the present Pope's encyclicals, is that what it's encyclical? And I read, and I was so happy. I was reading, I think, all the way up to 238. And he got to a precipice that he couldn't jump over. It was all about ecology, it was all about fairness, it was all about equality for all and food for everyone. And he got to that place where dogma was a barrier to him stepping forward. And I thought, no, there must be some way in which we can help ourselves to jump into what Jacques Derrida, for example, says, that abyss that creates the opportunity for justice. It's that new space that's probably filled with all kinds of old knowledge. By the way, Reverend Dagmar loves Bridget the goddess and the saint, and she celebrates her actually. So what I'm saying is I'm looking for places. So I see it in womanism. I am hopeful that womanism is expansive enough to include Ifa, which is something that I practice for my own spiritual uplifting and strength.
It is.
And thank you. And I'm also studying to be an ordained minister, which for me is also part of my homage to my ancestors who lived here. And so I'm a both-and kind of person, and I think to the degree that we can become more like that, we will find those really creative solutions to these horrendous problems that we have. But we have to have the courage, like she does, to step out regardless and do it anyway, through the fear.
So a comment, LaDonna Harris, American Baptist Seminary in West, I will say thank you to all of you for your presentations, and it makes me glad to see in the way that you present things, we hear sort of less of the challenge and more of the accomplishment. And that was highlighted for me, and I was just recently reading about Dagmar. She wrote, then came the year of my divorce. Insanity was less painful,
Yes.
and even more excruciating the day of my spouse's remarriage.
Yes.
And so a lot of times what we hear is the accomplishment, and we can lose sight of the pain and the challenges and the frustration, some of the dehumanizing and demoralizing things that happen, like being excommunicated and all of those things. So I really appreciate and Cheryl raising the issue of hopefulness, that even though all these things happen, there is a hopefulness that comes, and out of that hopefulness, all of these wonderful accomplishments. So thank you all.
I would just like to say that was one of the most difficult experiences that because remember, as a Catholic, you marry forever, right? So she had this point of intersection where she had to live with the fact that she still felt like she was honestly married to him. And at the same time, and with the whole relationship, because they were a team on top of that, I have to say that I walked with her through some of those times. It was very difficult. And to come out on the other side, still in good relationship with her friend, whose former husband, and with an understanding of herself as a person who was called to do something different. That's really important.
Yeah, I think coming from Asian context with a very strong patriarchal culture, hopefulness, I think it's very important word to embrace. And especially, I really appreciate you, Marinda, to be able to acknowledge the roles of women, not only publicly but also domestically. And as you mentioned, how women plays at the center of hospitality and also at the center of healing, I think it's very important also from my own specific context in Indonesia. And yeah, this is, for me, it's very important to realize that women are the ritual experts and their roles need to be acknowledged from the small things to the party.
Yes.
Which one?
Go ahead. Jim.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you very much. I'm particularly interested in Ireland.
Yes.
And it seems like the conversation is moving toward this ritual expertise and the power of women, women of spirit and power. My question is this specifically for you, Joy, but also for other two of you. In your research in your particular area, especially starting with Ireland, did you bump into the practice of lament as led by women as practice of power in public?
I brushed up against it without going down that path.
Okay.
But thank you for calling my attention to that. I did have the privilege, since I was here, of using as resources a dissertation that had been done on Bridget and the vitae and a master's thesis on a more restricted part. And the research, I did this paper like 5 years ago and did not have time to go through all of it again. But I would commend the holdings here because there are dissertations here and resources here that will take you into the controversies. And there's some wonderful stories of Bridget that I can just imagine were made up by women who just really needed to have a story like that. Like she moved a river because it was inconvenient for the king, you know, and who was in that. So these powers are important, and they often had a lot to do with water in her case. And that's a theme that we kind of find in many of the faith traditions. So for me, it's wonderful to see how these all come up in all of these different traditions. And maybe women will have a place in bringing them together.
Women must have a place. Women do have a place.
Women, that's our expertise.
Women are the place when they come together.
It's that healing, hospitality, and harmony thing.
And speaking of women being the place, I'm curious to know more about Reverend Dagmar's self-identification as a lesbian and the care and love of women and just more about that.
Yes, and she also identifies herself as an a Yoruba priest and an Ifa devotee of sorts. She's not a priest of Ifa, but she has certainly made use of the tradition in guiding her path. It was foretold that she would become a priest in the Roman Catholic tradition when she had a reading years ago. She called herself a lesbian. In context, she was giving a speech at, I think, a National Women's Studies Association conference while her husband was governor. And she refused to take a stance that separated her from any women. And so it was complicated back in those days. You know, being a lesbian wasn't very popular years ago. And so those of us who were out were always being challenged by our identities. And she's claimed that point of privilege as being the governor's wife to include herself in that number so that, you know, okay, say, well, what are you going to do about me? Kind of thing. So it was a political statement, but she did not qualify it as political. She was very careful not to say, well, I don't really mean it. She didn't hedge on it at all. But I think Dick certainly understood what she meant by that, and her children, if they didn't understand right away, they certainly came to understand what she meant. She pushed against all of those boundaries ever since I've ever known her. It was important for her to see the world as a place where all people's voices are heard. And she's a very strong woman, so people either love her or hate her. But just as her voice is outspoken, she expects other people's voices to be outspoken too, and she gives support wherever she can in that regard.
Thank you.
She had someone, she knew Mother Teresa.
Oh, yes. There was, you know, Dagmar is 77 years old. If I tried to tell you her life, it would take forever. But she, when her husband was given this post in India, she decided, even though she had 2 children already and was pregnant with the third, she decided to work with Mother Teresa. And she spent that entire year, almost every day of that entire year, working directly with Mother Teresa. And he was an ambassador. She didn't have to do that kind of thing at all, but she did. And she wanted to know how you can help and feel that without trying to control. And Mother Teresa had that skill. She had developed that over time. You can't control the outcome, but you can do your job.
Yes.
Hi, thank you all. My name is Ian. I'm from Star King School for the Ministry. And I'm so glad that I remembered this presentation. Suddenly, I wish that I had remembered earlier. The thing that I want to mention is my appreciation for the comment about Reverend Dagmar announcing herself as lesbian, as well as the part about being in an open marriage. As a I'm not sure where she was in her spiritual leadership, but just from the way that you described, I imagine like her whole life was spiritual leadership. So to have such a position, like romantically, that is still not common, like LGBTQ movements have made quite a bit of progression, and I think that multiple partnerships is still like very, very frowned upon, especially for spiritual leaders, and I just really valued you including that piece. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes.
This is for Joy. Hi, Joy. I'm just wondering if you had access to some of the more Republic with a small R, or the material on Marinda from the actual indigenous peoples. Because in history, the conqueror always writes the history. And in Irish history in particular, because it was so suppressed by the English, a lot of the original people from the lands themselves, that was hidden or disappeared or destroyed. And I majored in Irish studies in New College, and a lot of the people there were Catholic. And when it comes to whether it was Breda, was she a real person or was she a myth that came to, or was she a real person or was they actually made a myth, because the dominant narratives always make someone, especially women, to be a myth. And after that school folded because of financial unfortunate things, a lot of the literature in San Francisco, which is the hotbed for Irish people, was donated to the church, to the school, and then the people of us who were still around there were privileged by having some of these books. And so there is a lot of material that is not from the dominant narrative that says that she is a real person, that she was made invisible because they didn't want to have women in the Catholic Church be real. I wonder if you had any access to any of that in your studies.
I did not make the time to try to find that. It's an obvious area to go to. And I encountered the fact that the way of writing something in pre-Christian Ireland was a completely different structure. So it wouldn't have survived well either, which is part of the reason when I refer to patchy things, they're annals, they're laws, they're religious tracts, they're all kinds of things, but they're piecemeal, and when you're not quite sure where they exist, taking our concept of what evidence looks like in order to create a historical conclusion is very different than what would have been accepted at that time. And so what you're bringing up is absolutely what I would expect, and it's part of the problem in reconstructing. I almost wonder whether it's much ado about something that's less important. The other thing that I ran across but have never pursued is there was another battle that was going on. The churches that followed the Celtic tradition were more apostolic in nature and tended to use the Gospel of John, not the Synoptic Gospels, whereas the Roman Church used the Synoptic. So there was a biblical tension there too that's only just, people have surfaced, but I don't think they've really plumbed how much of that was it because the culture there was more receptive to one, we got there first, I mean, lots of things. And maybe that's one of the other ways of hopefulness with a seminary is to go back and say, what are all the texts we now have? How can we reconstruct from those original texts read through the diversity we now have to put into place a hopeful structure for all people, not just those that are privileged.
Thank you. I would like to invite, first of all, thank you for your questions, thank you for your time. I would like to invite our program coordinator up to close this out. And one more time for the panelists, please.
Yes, and thank you so much to Kiana for your leadership as well. And so, yeah, I don't think I need to come all the way forward, but thank you all so much for coming up today. Please take some sandwiches home with you. As you can see, there's lots of those. And we hope to make this an annual event. So if you didn't get a chance to present today, or if you did present today, please think about presenting next year. And if you're interested in women's studies and religion in the certificate program or in any of our other events, let me know, and I'm happy to put you on the mailing list. Thank you all so much for coming.